Welcome to this episode of the Patrick Coffin Show. Just in time for the new year, we're going to talk about the great French Catholic thinker, René Girard, with one of his foremost interpreters, students, and collaborators, the founder of the Cornerstone Forum, Mr. Gil Bailie. But first, check out coffination.com. Find out what members in 25 countries are excited about. Coffination.com. That's the place to sign up and find out more about the largest culture-building website community in the world. Coffination.com. Come for the content, stay for the community. So our topic is the French Catholic philosopher René Girard. His writings from the 50s onward provide unique insights into things like Twitter mobs and bullying, trends, office politics, mimetic desire, the scapegoat mechanism. That's the whole sweet spot here. Get your nerd on. We're going to talk about René Girard with one of his foremost collaborators and proteges, Gil Bailie, who is here and will be shortly. Don't go away. As promised, Gil Bailie is the founder and president of the Cornerstone Forum. Well worth a visit there. It's an apostolate dedicated to unearthing the deeper roots of what we call the West. As I mentioned, Gil is a longtime friend and student, collaborator, you might say, with the late, great René Girard, emeritus professor at Stanford University, member of the French Academy, also the author, Gil is, of God's Gamble, The Gravitational Power of Crucified Love. Hello, Gil. Thanks for being here finally.
I'm very happy to be with you, Patrick.
Let me start very, very simple. For people who've never heard of him, who was René Girard? Tell us more.
Well, it's hard to say in a few words, but he was a French intellectual who came to the United States when he was young. His background is in history. He's a historian, a literary man. He held the chair of French culture and civilization at Stanford University for many years. And he found in the course of his work this principle of mimesis, or imitation. And that he was not the first to notice it, but he was the first to really unfold it in terms of its larger cultural implications. And so he spent decades of his life exploring what it means to notice that we are incredibly imitative creatures. There would be no culture without this capacity to imitate. Every culture would have to invent the wheel on its own. Every generation, I should say, would have to invent the wheel on its own if we didn't know how to imitate. So imitation is absolutely essential to the species that we are. All species have some form of it, but the degree to which we are imitative is really quite extraordinary. And so René spent a lifetime exploring the implications of that. And in the course of it, he discovered that he was able to make these insights, to discover these things, precisely because of the Judeo-Christian tradition that he had inherited tools for understanding the implications, the fact of mimetic desire, what he called mimetic desire. So let me give you a very simple example, which is, I hope, entertaining at the same time. Mm-hmm. Imagine you're walking through a department store, back when we used to have department stores.
Yeah. Look it up in the library, what that is, department store.
So you walk by and there's this huge table of various things, big sale today, and you look and you think, well, nothing there I want. And suddenly you hear this person say, holy cow, I can't believe they're selling this for this amount of money. And it interests you. You turn and you look, and here's this person holding, let's just say it's a gadget. Mm-hmm. And he's admiring it and thinking, what a great deal this is at this price. Mm-hmm. And you think to yourself, that is a good price. Maybe I should go over and take a look at it. And then you notice that there's several red ones and several blue ones, but only one green one.
Mm-hmm.
He has it in his hand. And then you think to yourself, if I were going to get one, I would rather have the green one.
Yeah.
And you have all kinds of rational reasons. This all seems perfectly rational. It's a good price, and the green one really would fit in some way. And then you move from checkers to chess. You know that if you indicate you're interested in that green one, kiss it goodbye. He's off with it. His interest in it will be intensified by your interest in it. So if you're very clever, you'll go down to the other end of the table and you will pretend to be interested in something else, hoping that without your interest, his own interest will dissipate, and he might even come down and get interested in what you're interested in. Mm-hmm. He finally decides he doesn't need it. He walks away, and you can go grab the green one. Now, all of this is a kind of a caricature. Mm-hmm. What happens in life all the time. Madison Avenue knows this about us. Politicians know this about us. It's just the way we are. We're incredibly imitative creatures. The problem is, in archaic societies, and of course in our own, if two hands reach for one object, their desire is intensified by the presence of a rival. Mm-hmm. So that the object, which may be mildly desired in the first instance, mm-hmm. becomes increasingly desired the more hands reach for it. And the more hands reach for it, the higher the level of conflictual energy that is going on. And people, and eventually, especially in archaic cultures, but it happens all the time in ours as well, actual violence breaks out. So the very mimetic principle that makes it possible for children to learn from their parents and from their elders, and for culture to pass on from one generation to the thing that makes us human. Also, if it's allowed to be infected by this competitive desire,
right?
To some extent, the competition can be, if it's governed in a way, it can be healthy. People compete for prizes or for positions of responsibility and so on. Nothing wrong with that, or even economic competition.
Or Gil, the race to cure a disease.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So these are very healthy forms of this, but they can only take place if the unhealthy, potentially violent forms of it are under control. Right. And what controls that is culture. And so culture is made possible by structures that keep us that allow enough rivalry and competition to exist so that innovation can happen, and that not only is tradition passed on, but improvements are made, and so on and so forth.
To kind of, just so I understand, to guarantee the spirit of competition, but in a way that takes out the violent part.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Does that explain things like, every year it seems there's a festival you can predict that someone's going to get mobbed, trampled, or beaten up at a Walmart during Black Thursday or some other sale. It's a kind of a latter-day department store.
Exactly.
There's a limited number of flat screens and a much bigger number of people who want that darn flat screen at that price.
Exactly. And so competition is, the mimetic desire is a fundamental principle of our existence. But The problem is that culture itself comes out of a particular resolution of that conflictual situation. And that is the following. And now I'm giving you the shorthand, very elementary version of something that's quite complex in René Girard's thought. But in an archaic setting, a competition would flare out and become violence. And what happens in a violent melee is that the level of cognition, you could say, drops precipitously, and everyone is scandalized. Now, René salvaged the word scandal from the New Testament because he showed that in understanding culture, a scandal is when someone is more preoccupied with his rival for an object, and often it's an object of affection, like a woman between two something. He's scandalized when his antipathy for his rival is greater than his desire for the object itself. At that point, it becomes self-defeating for everyone. He would rather, and we see this in our politics today, people would rather see, we would rather see our hated political enemy defeated or crushed than actually have our political friends and supporters cede politically. It's like a suicide mission. So that's what it means to be scandalized.
I guess that's rooted, of course, in the Greek, the etymology of it. Scandalon is Greek for obstacle. So these people are tripped up, as it were, by something that's secondary.
Exactly.
Their eyes off the ball now.
Exactly. Always and so to be scandalized, to allow ourselves to be scandalized, the only thing that solves this scandalization can, as it ripples out, it becomes like a barroom brawl from the old Western movies. Everybody's throwing punches at everybody else. Nobody knows why. It's just wild. And in the process of that, everyone is treating the person he's fighting as his bête noire, as his enemy, as the one who's responsible for all this.
Yeah.
Even though nobody has any idea who's responsible for it. It's a crazy law. Now, what happens is there's a polarization, polarization in this sense means one person, for example, will hurl an accusation at his immediate opponent that is so compelling that those within earshot of him turn their attention from their object of contempt to his object of contempt. And then more and more people do that, and more people do that. And in very quick order, a brawl of all against all becomes a mob of all against one. And that one is then lynched or killed or sent out of town or whatever.
Otherwise expelled. And, maybe ritually punished as crystallizing or personifying the evil that all are supposed to be fighting. Okay.
Exactly. And this brings peace to the community that has expelled him. So this is peace. I just wrote an article for Communio entitled Making Peace Through the Blood of the Cross. That this is how we humans have made peace, by forming an alliance with our former adversaries against another. We bond together with people who are just as agitated as we are, but we focus our agitation and our animosity on the same figure. And in doing that, we create bonds And when that figure is expelled, there's a sense of peace in the community.
Gil, this sounds very familiar as you're talking about this all against one dynamic. I'm thinking of the Frank Capra movie, Meet John Doe, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Gary Cooper. I've always recommended this film. I think it's the second greatest Frank Capra movie. Also set at Christmas Eve, also about a man in despair who wants to kill himself. And I'll put a link into the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. If you've not seen Meet John Doe by Frank Capra, it's a perfect expression of this. It's also an expression, although 70 or 80 years before the fact, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. It's all predicted there. But the friendship of Herod and Pilate over the body of Jesus.
Of course, it's absolutely classic, and that's something that René spoke of often. There's that little phrase that sort of went unnoticed until he made it. I mean, other people have noticed it, but he understood it in terms of his mimetic theory. These two figures were at odds, but then they were joined in their mutual animosity. So it happens. It happens all the time. But
I've got that from Fulton Sheen, that little insight. But I'm glad to know he thought of it as well. The Gerard Reader has a nice sampling of his books and his thought. I first encountered René Girard at the urging of my friend and teacher, Dr. Scott Hahn, who mentioned two men at the same time one day. One was René Girard, the other was Father Walter Ong, S.J. of St. Louis University, a mentor, collaborated with Marshall McLuhan. And the first book of Girard's that I read was I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning. I'm slowly working my way through the whole corpus of his writing. Can I ask you about groupthink and the mindlessness of the mob? There's a book by M. Scott Peck called People of the Lie, and he's the guy who wrote The Road Less Traveled. And there's a chapter there on the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and it's I think, classic example of an army captain who led his soldiers into a village called My Lai in Vietnam during the war, and they just opened fire in a 4-hour killing spree, women, children, old people who had nothing to do with the war. And at the end, when they were interviewed individually, they were at a total loss to explain this mindless bloodbath that they participated in. That seems to be what Girard is pointing at. This
exactly.
I'm not sure how to phrase it correctly, but the horse blinders, hyper-focusing, and the loss of rationality, almost like a kind of individual will being overridden by the group, unless I'm overdoing the
no,
thing.
you're absolutely right, Patrick. And one of the things that we don't realize, and it's high time that we did realize it, because our culture is getting thinner and thinner in terms of its Christian, Judeo-Christian foundation, which has served as a kind of monitor to this kind of madness for centuries. And not only a monitor, but something that brings the mimetic dynamic into its sacramental, the sacramental goal, you could say, is we're made to imitate. We're made to respond to someone who says, "Come, follow me." We're made for it. Mm-hmm. It's just that we await, and we end up in the course of our lives to follow this, that, and the other person, and who knows where it leads us. So there's a tremendous spiritual and sacramental understanding of mimesis, but we live in a world which is becoming de-Christianized, and to the extent that we're de-Christianized, these impulses, these primal impulses, begin to show themselves, and you can see it in mobs, in cultural phenomenon of various in social media mobs, and so on. So there's the capacity. Now, in war, it's especially delicate, and that's why warriors are trained, A, to follow orders, B, to stay within in their rank and in their mission, and so on. But when you're in intense combat, you have to these structures that hold you back from becoming berserk had better be very well inculcated, because the power of violence, anybody who thinks that you can be in the presence of violence and keep your rationality hasn't been in the presence of much violence. So we just have to realize, people think, oh, well, I'm just going to go live like a native and do away with these structures, moral structures and cultural structures.
Yeah.
Those come in very handy when things go sideways.
Could you say, Gil, that the biblical roots of our law, the rule of law, as we call it, is really what we call the first and last line of defense to keep this violent impulse in check, so that there are some things you cannot do, and if you do, we will collectively punish you. The state will punish you, maybe even with death.
Sure.
And as the culture, you're talking about thinning, I think it's a good word, it's becoming, or going from hearty French onion soup, which is robust and thick, to gruel. And so the ability of the laws to be upheld is somehow dependent on the people who make the laws themselves. So, as culture's upstream from all this.
That's right. And when we live in a culture that is under the protection of institutions and traditions and memories and so on and so forth, we don't notice those things, but they're sustaining us all the while. And if we aren't taught to appreciate them, we think we did it on our own. We think that we became independent and able to think for ourselves all by ourselves, but we didn't. We got here. They used to say in East Tennessee, where I grew up, if you see a turtle on a fence post, he didn't get there on his own.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't get here on our own. This culture has provided this, and now we're waking up one fine day and we decide, I don't need it. Look at me, I'm doing fine. It's not true. These cultural structures are incredibly important, and we think we can dispense with them.
Yeah,
it's a recipe for chaos.
I keep quoting Chesterton, who said, "Don't tear down a fence until you know why it was erected."
Absolutely. Well, while we're on the subject of culture, I wanted to say something about the Christian contribution to this, because you mentioned law, and in the Judeo-Christian unfolding of the revelation, we have the old law, the law of the Old Testament, and the law of the New Testament, which is charity. But they're not separate laws.
Yeah. And they're not contradictory.
One moves from another, and so this enriching of this, and what happens from law to charity is that the law begins to operate in one's heart, and one recognizes, first of all, how vulnerable, how predisposed we are, how fallen we are, and how in need we are always of the grace, not only the grace that allows the interior law to operate, but the exterior structures that remind us that if you go over 55 miles an hour on this road, you're going to be pulled over, etc. In other words, the old-fashioned law we don't dispense with it just because we're beginning to internalize it.
Yeah.
They operate together. But the point of it from a Christian point of view is to instill in ourselves these principles, and we do that by identifying or imitating Christ. So Christ, imitate me. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is all, in other words, René later discovered that he had inherited this insight from Christianity, even though it hadn't been fully explicated.
Mm-hmm. Could you say that in Girard's thought, when Jesus says, "Follow me," you mentioned earlier, that's a synonym for imitate me?
Yeah.
Because he knows we're made to follow something. He's saying, follow me. We want to be like something. Be holy as I am holy. And Jesus himself is imitating his Father in his human nature, right? He's conforming himself to his Father's perfect will.
And he, unlike Moses and unlike Muhammad, he doesn't leave a long list of to-dos. He boils them down to two. And at the heart of them is follow me. So it's interesting about Christianity is that Christ simply says, he simply is his message. Yeah. And so he says, this is not a conceptual thing. This is a mystery. It's a mystery of love and devotion and selflessness and so on. So just look at what I do and go do it. So that's tremendous. But in no way he says, I only do what I see the Father doing, and the Father is the God from the Old Testament. So there is no break, as Marcion.
Yeah, we're not Marcionists.
Those things go together. We need the structures of the law, but to be really faithful to it, we have to interiorize it, which is what, pardon the male version of this, gentleman, what we call a gentleman, is someone who to some degree has internalized, who doesn't have to have somebody monitoring him all the time in order to do the right thing. I've said a million times, if we don't teach children to do the right thing when nobody's looking, we can't hire enough police.
That's right.
And so internalizing.
My dad used to say things when I was a kid that made no sense to me whatsoever. Now they make perfect sense. One of them was, locks are for honest people.
Yeah, there you go.
In other words, if you're bad, you're going to break the law. It doesn't matter. The lock is going to snap. The lock is like a gentleman's agreement. But if you're intent on stealing something, locks are easy to get through.
That's right.
Lingering a little bit further on boiling it down to two, love thy neighbor as thyself and love God. When you said he didn't leave a long to-do list, but he did list a do this list, do this in memory of me.
Yeah, but he gave us himself, as he does in the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. He didn't come to give us a message in the ordinary sense of that term. He came to give us himself. And the Eucharist is the continuation of that gift. It's not a commemoration. It's
in the sense of remembering last Tuesday.
No, it is a continuation of that gift and a reception of that gift, a grateful reception of that gift. And it is effective. It is effective. And I should say something because we're talking about René. René was a very faithful Catholic. In his youth, he went the way of all French intellectuals. But in his 30s, he came back to the church. And
can I ask you, Gil, did he ever disclose to you or write about what was the grace in his life at that time that made him return and go all in with all his chips?
Well, there was a medical problem that frightened him, And that was the beginning of a gradual movement. And I had the same. I was raised a Catholic, but in the 60s I kind of went sideways. And so
That's so weird, Gil, because no one did that in the 60s.
well, I tell people that I'm both a cradle Catholic and an adult convert. So I have the benefits of both. But in any event, René, when I met him, which was 35 years ago, he was attending, and he did until the day he died, attending a high Gregorian Mass in Palo Alto, California, every Sunday with his wife. A very high Mass.
Extraordinary form Latin, you mean?
And it wasn't occasionally, but it was Latin was in and out of it, but it was a high. It was a high Gregorian Mass, sung, and really quite beautiful. And he went out of his way to attend that Mass, and he was a very. He wasn't in any way doctrinaire, and he didn't wear his Catholicism on his sleeve. But because he and I don't mean to leave the implication that he and I had a relationship unlike any. I mean, every relationship is unlike any other, but partly because I was not an academic, and partly because my faith was so important to me as it was to him. Mm-hmm. He and I spent a good deal of time talking about faith, which is, I don't think, is something that happened with many of his other friends. So I did get a sense of his faith. But I want to tell you a story, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
I've told this story, but because you showed the book God's Gamble, one of my goals in life is to have good Orthodox Catholic theologians and philosophers understand how important René's work can be to them. And because some of the more traditional Catholic thinkers are suspicious, and they should be, of somebody who comes in from left field, as René did, from the French intellectual tradition and from what some people suspected of being sociology and anthropology and so on and so forth. One of my goals in life is to get more and more of the very traditional Roman Catholic theologians to realize what a friend they have in René Girard. And so I'll tell you this story. Not only did he attend that Mass that I told you about, which shows his fidelity to the church.
And I know to my audience, he went out of his way to go to this Mass, right? It wasn't next door. A lot of people have a scruple about being a Roman Catholic. It's okay to go out of your way to go to a solid divine liturgy.
He did. And it was one of these very sparsely attended but absolutely magnificent Masses. But here's the story. The first day I met him, I had to tell you this, I've told it many times. I was at the University of California bookstore in the early 80s, I think. And I walked by a sale table, and there was a copy of a book called Violence and the Sacred. And it caught my eye. And I picked it up, and it was by René Girard. And
wasn't a green book, was it?
No. There was nobody else wanting it. That's why I was on sale.
Gotcha.
But so I saw René Girard. I had seen his name in footnotes, but I had no idea if he was dead or alive. I mean, but it interested me, so I bought it. And I brought it home, and I started reading it. And in 30 minutes, I knew that he'd broken the code. There was just I had this sense that they had revealed something, been hidden since the foundation of the world, to use the title of another.
The title of one of his books, right?
I started reading it, and I had some friends that were into biblical studies at the time. This is my mea culpa. It shows you part of where I went off. I knew people that were involved in the Jesus seminar.
Yeah.
Remember that?
I do, yeah.
Oh.
Vote with little colored balls on whether or not you think Jesus actually said this, that, and the other.
Oh my gosh. Anyway,
right. Bart Ehrman and company.
The man who had organized that, God rest him, he was a good man in his own way. But he called me up. He organized a conference for my little town, Sonoma, California. And he called me up out of the blue, and he said, about a dozen or so of these biblical scholars coming in from around the world, or around the country probably, to this conference, have gotten René Girard to agree to come up and spend a day with them to talk about the implication of his work for biblical studies. And Bob said to me, I don't have a place to hold it. Could we hold it in your office? And I thought I'd been hit by lightning. If you asked me then, who would you rather meet in the whole world? It would have been a tie between John Paul II and René Girard. He came to my office, so I met him when he came up from Stanford to my office to spend the day talking to these biblical scholars. And it was a marvelous day, and I'm just going to tell you two of the moments, the beginning and the end of the day. He gave a talk for about an hour, which was mind-boggling. And really, and these biblical scholars who they have learned that there's nothing that will move them out of their sort of institutional skepticism. But they were kind of rocked back on their heels. And one of them very meekly raised his hand and he said, Professor Girard, it almost sounds as though what you're saying is that in terms of its revelatory power, biblical literature is categorically superior to all other literature.
Astounding.
But you're a Stanford professor. You're not saying that, are you? And René said, categorically. And there wasn't another biblical scholar in the room that would have said that. So,
or believed it, maybe.
Exactly. And so I thought to myself, this guy's the real deal. I knew it from reading his books. But at the end of the day was the clincher. The day was amazing. Now and we could get to this if you want, there's an apocalyptic dimension to René's thought, as there is to the New Testament, as you know. So he understood history not progressively, but apocalyptically. And
what did he mean by that?
Well,
not progressively, but apocalyptic, with the end in mind. What is that?
Let me come back to that. Let me just finish this little story. So in the course of the day, the apocalyptic, in other words, Christianity is. So I interrupt the story and say, when we humans have been creating and recreating and rejuvenating culture for time out of mind by doing something that is structurally identical to what we did to Christ on Golgotha. There was nothing unique about that. What was unique about that was the person we did it to, not the thing itself. All other instances of that, which all the successful instances of that, produced catharsis and reconciliation.
Like the scapegoating of the Old Testament?
Exactly.
Animal sacrifices.
Animal sacrifice, but in real human sacrifice. When there was a frenzy of confusion and violence, if you could focus that violence on one figure, like a witch. I want to tell you a story about a medieval witch story. But anyway, before we get to that, I'm interrupting my stories here. So when we did it to Christ, it broke the system, because he brought to that experience, you could say, other people who were victimized that way might have been structurally innocent. And what I mean by that is, if and this is a stereotype that I'm offended by myself because I'm a Southerner, but if you say that in the 19th century a rural white community lynched a black man for stealing a horse, if he found out that he actually stole the horse, that doesn't rob him of his structural innocence, because the community almost certainly lynched him for reasons that had nothing to do with the horse. He was the occasion for the venting of all the animosities that were swirling around in that community. And thanks to him, they had a cathartic release of all those animosities and were made peaceful again. So that's the way the old system used to work. It used to take all the social animosities, focus it on a victim, kill or expel the victim, and have the community be at peace. But that's not what happened when Christ died, because his innocence was not structural, it was ontological. He was perfectly innocent. And the system threw itself up against that and collapsed. And what was revealed was the innocence of the victim. Now that seems like a commonplace today. We all know that victims are innocent, but that's only because we are products of a Christian tradition. And now all the anti-Christians are trying to exploit the privilege of victimization in order to destroy Christianity. It's the most pernicious kind of, but it's precisely what you would expect. Christianity destroys everything except its own perversion. So that the only way you can mount a case against Christianity is to claim that it's the victimizer. You have to use the Christian understanding against Christianity. And so anyway, the point is that Christ wrecks the old system for taking away the sins of the world. When John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world," the world would have said, like, he can take away the sins of the world. The world would have said, "We don't need him. We've got a way to take away the sins of the world. We vent all our animosity on one figure and we're at peace again." What they didn't know is that he's going to destroy that system. And therefore, if you want to have peace, you have to do what he's going to tell you to do, because he's going to rob you of the antique way of creating peace.
Yeah. And isn't that sentiment contained in what Caiaphas said? Better for the nation to live, better for one man to die than the nation.
That's exactly
laser-like focus on all that resentment.
Exactly right.
Gil, can I shift to movies just for a moment, or back to movies? The story that you're telling now in explaining the evolution or the development of René Girard's thinking in a biblical sense reminds me a little bit of the movies, the filmography of Mel Gibson.
Mm-hmm.
Let me explain. Mel Gibson, if you look at his at the IMDb database filmography, after he made Tim, he played a mentally handicapped kid in 1979. After that, it's I'll leave a couple of them out because they're comedies, but the Lethal Weapon series, Mad Max in its various iterations. Let's see, Man Without a Face, We Were Soldiers, Ransom, Payback, Get the Gringo, Conspiracy Theory, Bloodfather, Edge of Darkness, Signs, The Patriot. They're all the same basic story. It's an innocent man who was harmed in his past, and he's out for blood vengeance. He makes The Passion of the Christ in 2003 and 4, and all hell maybe literally breaks loose. He's attacked. He makes terrible mistakes. However you want to describe what happened to Mel Gibson after that movie, and then it was like a creative tectonic shift because his next movie, the Apocalypto. It's called Apocalypto. Magnificent.
That's one of the. I've only seen maybe two of his movies. I'm not a big moviegoer, but Apocalypto is tremendously important movie.
Yeah, Apocalypto, and then Hacksaw Ridge, about a non-violent soldier named Desmond Doss. You know how I'm not sure you've noticed this, Gil, but even long classic movies can be summarized in one sentence. Gone with the Wind is summarized as, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. The Empire Strikes Back, Luke, I am your father. The tagline for Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge is, Lord, give me one more. One more, Lord. He's praying to save one more soldier. He never fires his gun once. So it's almost like the Passion of the Christ affected Mel Gibson in a certain way. And it's the scapegoat who, upon being murdered, ends this mimetic cycle. Because he extends forgiveness for the first time in history. Am I overplaying the card here with this?
No, that's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, in this article I wrote recently for Communio, I ended by saying all those pagans who created their cultural solidarity in events like the one on Golgotha, instead of us looking down on them and saying, oh, they were terrible and we're so much better and all that, what we have to realize is that this was their way of crouching at the foot of the cross, awaiting the victim to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That announcement from the cross didn't just have to do with the people within earshot of it. It had to do with the whole human race, in my opinion. And huge, eschatologically and apocalyptically significant moment.
Let me, if I can kick the tires a little bit here. I came across something in an interview that René Girard did some years ago. And as it reads, I have to disagree with it, but maybe I'm misreading the context. He's asked about the Gospel's description of Jesus' death as a sacrifice, and he's quite strong in his answer. He says, the interviewer says, surely the crucifixion is still the sacrifice of Christ. And his reply is, there's nothing in the Gospels to suggest that the death of Jesus is a sacrifice. Whatever definition, expiation, substitution, and so on, that we may give for that sacrifice. At no point in the Gospels is the death of Jesus defined as a sacrifice. The passages that are invoked to justify the sacrificial concept of the Passion both can and should be interpreted with no reference to sacrifice in any of the accepted meanings. Well, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, under Part 1 of the Profession of Faith, if you do a keyword search of sacrifice, it's repeatedly called a sacrifice. So is he moving against the substitutionary atonement theory, where God the Father unleashes his anger on the victim so that he won't unleash his anger on you and I?
You know, when René repented of all that, to make a long story short, but he acknowledged that when he came to this country, he absorbed a Protestant ethos that for which he had no immunities, and part of it was precisely that attitude about sacrifice and so on. It was an Old Testament thing and so on.
Right.
And he did it, in a certain way. It fit with what he was coming to grips with in his research. But he later became friends with a friend of mine, Raman Schwager, Jesuit Raman Schwager, who was the head of the theological faculty at Innsbruck.
What was his name, Gil, again?
Raman Schwager.
Raman Schwager. Okay.
Yeah.
Good Chinese name there.
He was he challenged René on that and convinced him he was wrong. And René admitted he was wrong. And he regretted it. And he acknowledged his, in some of his later writings, he acknowledged that it was a mistake of his. And I was with him. I used to sit in a seminar every 2 weeks with him for years and years. And in one of those seminars, somebody said something, read it out of the book like you just did, say, well, what about this? And he read this thing. Mm-hmm. And René said, I was just showing off, I think.
Well, that's to his credit, because a lot of people double down on things like that. If someone could quote me from 15 years ago, I'd probably cringe as well.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, to put your mind at rest, he understood that instinct was erroneous. But before we go on, there was a lot of things to talk about. I do want to finish my first day I met him story.
Yes.
The reason, the last question of the day had to do with the fact that this eschatological dimension, so I have to say one more thing about that before I get to the story. Mm-hmm. Once that mechanism for creating peace out of violence, which is what we humans have been doing for time out of mind, once that is broken by the Christian revelation, and of course it takes a long time for the revelation to fully bring about its deconstruction of all of those impulses and of that structure. Mm-hmm. The ability to recognize the innocence of the victim, even the structural innocence of the victim, means that you can't create order out of disorder anymore. It has to arise from another source. And if you don't go to that source, the disorder will mount and mount and mount and become literally apocalyptic. René's last book is about the escalation to extremes of violence, which would be world-consuming. So there's a real eschatological dimension. And in that first day I met him in the early 80s, he touched on that. And at the end of the day, there was a rich conversation. One of these biblical scholars sort of meekly put his hands in the air and he said, Professor Girard, this is quite mind-boggling, and a little bit alarming. What are we going to do about it? Because we Americans, we want to fix it.
Yep.
And René, he was a very modest man. And he said, well, we're all called to different things. And it's a very big problem. But maybe we should all begin with personal sanctity.
Beautiful.
And
That's a very unscholarly reply.
I thought, this is my guy. And afterwards, I said to him, René, you said the S word right there in front of all those biblical scholars. So that's the kind of person he was. I mean, he could admit that he did something in his early writings. Mm-hmm. He was convinced by Raman Schwager that he had gone off the wrong, gone off the edge there. And he was very humble about things he had written in the past. Very faithful.
That's amazing. And he kind of tripped over is probably the wrong word, although it evokes the sense of scandalon. He made a study of novels as a young scholar, correct? And this is sort of how he stumbled upon the dynamics of scapegoating and mimetic desire, and really wildly diverse or eclectic sources of literature. That's the basis of,
Absolutely.
is it Desire, Deceit, and the novel?
That's right.
Deceit.
That's
Okay.
that's his first, yeah.
And that started that engine up, and that's when he began to really formulate what became his whole life project.
He taught French literature for a long time. He was a very accomplished historian. As I said, I was in seminars with him for years and years, and I was always astounded at his detailed recollection of his European history, especially. He was a historian. He was trained as a historian, but he got interested in literature, especially French literature or European novels, and it's there that he discovered the mimetic principles. And then when somebody said to him, "You should go into the field of anthropology," so he read everything. He sort of absorbed the field of anthropology, and then he turned to the Bible. Saw that the Bible uncovered the whole thing.
Yep.
It was all brought into, that was his journey, so from historian to literary man to anthropology to biblical thinking.
I want to give a shout out to my friend and Nationista member John Ray, who put the bee in my bonnet about doing a show on this, and that made me think that you and I had met several years ago in San Diego, Gil. And I believe that John will correct me, but it's not live, so I can get away with murder here. He was at a conference, I believe, in Ottawa, and René Girard was there. This is years ago. And someone asked a question from the floor, and after a pause, René said, "Oh, I thought you were going to put it this way," and he rephrased the question in a much more potent way than the questioner had, and then had like 9 different angles of possible ways to answer the question. That he had this almost ability to download an enormous amount of material to make it seem smooth as glass.
Well, I have to tell you this. Again, I was in these seminars, 2-hour seminars every 2 weeks for years. And it was amazing because it would be, there would be 6 or 7 people in the room. It was not a big group. These were visiting scholars, or maybe a couple of Stanford scholars, a couple of visiting scholars that were interested. So it was always changing. There were 3 or 4 of us that were the same. And an issue would be raised, and the conversation would go around. And these are all, except for myself, all very high academic people who always have a very profound thought on whatever subject's going on. So each person would sort of offer his or her, best understanding of what's going on. It would come to René, and he would say something, and everybody else in the room would say, they'd just look at each other, and they'd say, "That is so obvious. Why did none of us see it?" I mean,
he just distilled to the pith.
Well, not only that, but he saw a dynamic at work, which the other attempts to analyze the situation failed to see. I often said, he was just wired in a different way. He had a gift for seeing into a situation.
I'm willing to bet that he suffered in his own way. Kind of a wandering Jew, not welcome here and not welcome there. Too Catholic for academe. Not sort of not enough this, too much of that.
My friendship with him was based in part on the fact that I'm not an academic. He had a grudge against the academy his whole life, and the academy had a grudge against him. He had a chair at Stanford University, a very prestigious chair. But he told me, he said, "Look, if 2 years later in my career, I would not have been offered that job. I would end up at some small Catholic college." But at the time, there was just this moment in time when he had written books that were becoming, important, and Stanford offered him a position and he took it. He was at Johns Hopkins before.
Mm-hmm.
Stanford was like the crown jewel. But he said, and he probably would have been happier at a small Catholic college, because he had good friends at Stanford, but the academic world at Stanford was inhospitable to anybody who was seriously Christian.
Don't want to get ahead of the church here, but do you believe that René Girard was a saint?
Well, I guess it's a question of capital S or small s. He was a saintly man, in the sense that he was humble, he was kind, he could be fierce in defending the truth as he saw it, but he was a gentle, kind, wonderful human being. I had the privilege of, he had some strokes near the end, and he couldn't speak, and I had the privilege of, I probably shouldn't say this on air, but I had the privilege of sitting with him when he couldn't speak, just holding his hand. And he had a smile, he would just smile. And there was just something really unbelievably tender about that. And so I think it was a privilege that I was given. I do think he's a saint, but I mean, will he be canonized?
Well, who knows? Bishop Robert Barron referred to him as a 20th century doctor of the church, which is quite the accolade.
I think that's possible if people understood, the implications of his work. I don't think that's an understatement.
The life of Marshall McLuhan in some ways parallels Girard. I don't know if they ever corresponded or knew about each other's work, but McLuhan also had strokes near the end, and his voice was very all caramel vowels, as his biographer says, and he was ironically stilled by strokes at the end. The great communicator who suddenly can't speak, but
right.
But then that childlike witness of not just believing in God, not just assenting to the teachings of the magisterium, but trusting in God moment by moment. Big difference. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, it was the great privilege of my life to, it was a total accident. I mean, when I met René, he was at the height of his popularity. Mm-hmm. Any academic in the world would have given anything to spend 30 minutes with him. I spent all day with him the first day I met him, and saw him regularly for years and years and years. It was a privilege. And he would, when I was writing my first book about his work, we were having lunch at the Stanford Faculty Club, and at that time he was being written off as a Christian who's just out there trying to, prove Christianity.
Yeah, catechism thump or what have you.
Exactly. And so I said to him, René, my intention in writing that first book was to outflank the academic embargo and just write a book that the ordinary person could read using his work. And so I said, I don't know, René, I started doing this because I saw that the embargo was there. But this book I'm writing is going to be unbelievably Christian. So it might just cause more problems. And he leaned over the table and he said, let's burn our boats on the beach.
Like it. Chips all in.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up what I could talk your ear off on this, Gil. There's something I watched that reminded me very much of Mimetic Desire and Girard's theories. I'm going to put it up as a link inside patrickcoffin.media. I want folks to watch this. It was an experiment done a couple years ago. It's on film, and it's testing the thesis of how extremely or how absurdly will people imitate someone. So it's the setting is I'll make it really brief. The setting is the waiting room for an optometrist office, and the people are there, and a young girl arrives, early 20s or so. What she doesn't know is that everyone in the room is an actor. So it's a legitimate office, and she has an actual appointment, but it's all there to test her and others. So she provides her name, she sits down, she starts reading a magazine, something like that. And about 10 seconds later, everyone in the room who's waiting also stands up, looks straight ahead, and then sits down. The whole thing takes about 5 or 6 seconds. And she's looking around, what is this? Five minutes go by, same thing, everyone stands up. Now, one by one, the people go into their appointments, and new people who are not part of the experiment, so they're also being tested. So sooner or later, she joins them, of course, because she doesn't want to not stand up. And at the end, she's the last one there, and someone new comes in, and the end of the story, she stands up, and the camera's on the other person going, what is going on here? It's really brilliant. It's very simple, but how we are, it's not that we want things, it's that we want things that others want. Mm-hmm. How do you remember the ice bucket challenge a couple of years ago, Gil? It's a huge thing on social media. You fill up a vat of water with ice and you splash it on your head, and it's supposed to help ALS or some medical thing. It was a worldwide phenom. Okay. I don't think it did much to forward the cure for any disease or Pokemon, any of these massive fads that come out of nowhere.
Right.
I'm sure René Girard would have things to say about that, especially with the speed with which social media amplifies this process.
Well, I'm working on a book right now that's going to deal in part with that, or at least with the business of social hysteria. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's incredibly mimetic, and it's a symptom of how in a way rootless we are. In other words, the more embedded you are in an actual community, mm-hmm. actual relationships, both horizontal relationships and spiritual relationships, the more you have about you a family, a community, a real community, mm-hmm. not mm-hmm. results community of social media. The more you have that, the less likely the less you're sort of a leaf blown off a tree, and you just end up in some whirlwind. Mm-hmm. So I think we live in a world now where we've emphasized this autonomous individuality so much, which is anthropologically completely implausible. The idea of autonomous individuality makes no sense in terms of the kind of creatures we are. We mm-hmm. are not autonomous individuals. We're creatures that are made for community and family and those subsidiary institutions and so on and so forth. So the autonomous individuality and my rights and all of that stuff creates people that are more and more vulnerable to the social hysterias and the mobs.
Gil, could you say that the American project is a kind of threat or a counterbalance to this not counterbalance, I guess a contradiction to this incarnational need for community with its America's rugged individualism? Think of "Don't tread on me," my rights, my happiness, my pursuits. It's it's anti-communitarian in a way, at least if it's untethered from this rootedness you were talking about.
Yeah, I think as you know, I'm sure, Patrick, there are things in our founding, the founding of our republic, which are utterly different from, say, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, totally different.
Yeah.
The American Revolution is it has too much emphasis on the autonomous individual, no doubt. but it has also a base, a communitarian base, constitutional principles that bind us together, and so on. So, and it is what we have. We don't. It's not like we have the luxury of just saying, well, let's throw this out. And so, the best we can do in this situation is try to draw out those or emphasize those parts of our communal experience, our historical experience, which are anthropologically sustainable, and downplay the ones which are perilous if they're overemphasized, like the individuality and the whole everybody's demanding their rights and so on and so forth, and everybody's a victim. There's a lot of craziness. So I think we have some resources there in terms of our culture, but we're going against the tide, because there is a tide in this culture that emphasizes the individual, and it's just an anthropologically implausible understanding of who we are.
And it presumes, and you see this in these victim groups, like all the hashtag groups that bind themselves together in victimhood, they identify the community with authoritarianism.
Yeah,
Not even authority. There's a complete pendulum swing.
Or even the family. You see some people writing about the family. Oh, it's a terrible thing. It's such a burden. Who wants it anymore? Let's open it up. And, I mean, this is madness. People don't realize that if you lose your roots, it's you become vulnerable to the worst kind of madness. And so we have a long way to go. And I think the church, which is also in a crisis today, as you know, but I think the church is one of the few institutions, wounded as it is today, that can and should provide something of an alternative to that deracinated individuality.
And I've interviewed a guy called Dr. Nicholas Carderas, who wrote a wonderful book that I'll throw people back to at the link, patrickcoffin.media. Nick Carderas wrote a book called Glow Kids. It's on cell phone addiction. And he did a study of all the school shooters from about Columbine onwards. And it's the same template. It's the same kid. Either divorce, heavy-duty porn use, father either absent or abusive, not surrounded by those social structures of support and encouragement and a sense of guardrails. It's all there. You can see it working itself out negatively.
Yeah. We're in a much graver crisis than most people realize, but we have to do what we can. I mean, the church herself is in the midst of one. So, but I suppose it's always been thus at one level or another.
Well, sinners have been trying to destroy the church for 2,000 years, and our Lord has a way of continually bouncing us upward. So we shouldn't be fundamentally worried about it.
That's right.
But in the meantime, my metaphor is that our Lord's enjoying an extended nap in the front of the boat again. Yeah.
Well, let me throw in another metaphor. I'm going to go back. When you mention all those Mel Gibson movies, I never watch movies alone. So I watch movies if I watch movies with my wife. My wife doesn't like violence at all. So, and therefore we watch almost no movie. But so I don't know the Mel Gibson movies, but I do know Apocalypto and I know the Passion of Christ. I want to go back to the Passion of Christ.
Yep.
Because I've said 1,000 times, so this is maybe the Marian part. Mel Gibson's depiction of Mary at the crucifixion, on the way to the crucifixion, is, I think, unsurpassed. The look on her face, I forget the actress's name.
Yeah, Maya Morgenstern. She
conveyed a combination. I love the acting profession, and if you can convey mixed emotions, faith and pain and suffering knowing that this has to be and all of it. There's something about his depiction of Mary at the suffering of Christ, which I think all Catholics should learn to emulate.
Mm-hmm.
It's excruciating, but just as you were saying, we know we will not be abandoned. We know that Christ will make something out of this that we can't imagine. And so we follow along, being as faithful as we can, even as we watch unfold something that's completely catastrophic.
I can see that scene. She's walking, almost tracking Satan in the crowd during the scourging, and how prescient of Mel Gibson to depict Satan basically as transgendered.
Uh-huh. Oh, absolutely.
A quasi-male figure played by an actress. Very disturbing and effective. Peter Crave says he could have called it the Passion of Mary.
That's exactly right. I believe that. I think so. And one more thing.
Yeah.
Apocalypto is a Girardian movie from start to finish. It starts with scapegoating, and it ends with them looking out and seeing the Spanish galleon there coming in. They don't know what to make of it.
Right.
But they don't realize that represents a lot of different things, not all of which we're happy, but it represents Christianity.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a huge blessing to these people who are looking out at it. That's a tremendously powerful film.
I love that ending. Yeah, he focuses right in the center of the shot is the cross on that boat. So whatever peccadillos or foibles of European civilization, Jesus Christ is arriving on his boat.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that's really powerful. By the way, my wife also does not like violent movies, and she and I both had she really sobbed at the end of Hacksaw Ridge. So it's the war movie for people who don't like war movies. Christian to the core. Wow. Gil, there was one more question I wanted to ask you. You were talking about Maya Morgenstern. Most people don't know this, but a few years ago she disclosed something that only Mel Gibson and at least one other man knew at the time. But when they were shooting that in 2003, I believe, mostly in Italy, she didn't tell anyone that she was 7 months pregnant.
Really?
Mm-hmm. So if she had the motherly glow, that's probably why.
Uh-huh.
Just all providential, right? Providential.
And at 7 months, the motherly emotions are palpable.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Awesome.
That's a very interesting thing.
Well, Gil, I learned a ton. I cannot believe how fast the last hour and 19 minutes have gone. What was René Girard's last book? What's the title? Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Not Evolution of Desire.
It's I have it on my shelf over here. It's about it's a play on words, and it's about the apocalyptic situation.
Okay, I'll find it, and we can another reason to draw people to patrickcoffin.media, as well as the website of the Cornerstone Forum.
As soon as we sign off, I'll remember the name of it.
Yeah, Murphy's Law.
In French, it was one thing. In English, it was another. But I don't remember quite.
Yeah, Gil, the French. I mean, they've got a different word for everything. Well, thanks for being on the show, Gil. I'm honestly, and your dad, I know this is going to get a lot of great feedback. And I'll put all the links to the books of René Girard and your book, God's Gamble. Also send folks to the Cornerstone Forum where they can weigh in. So again, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your work, and a big, long-time admirer of yours. I'm happy to have finally connected, Gil.
You're doing God's work, so keep it up, Patrick.
All right, very good. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear, and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.